All right, welcome all. We'll get this show on the road here. On behalf of the Department of Business and Economics and Marietta College, welcome to the 42nd annual Milton Friedman Lecture. My name is Greg Delameester. I'm a professor of economics, the Milton Friedman Professor of Economics, a faculty member here in the department. The Milton Friedman Lecture Series is co-sponsored by the Economic Roundtable of the Ohio Valley and the Department of Business and Economics here at Marietta College. And it's made possible in part due to the generosity of the late Lester Meredith, class of 1927. Mr. Meredith, a strong believer in the virtue of free markets, endowed this speaker series in honor of the Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman. While Professor Friedman was a stout free market advocate and representative of what was or is still called the Chicago School of Economics, Mr. Meredith was very adamant that the lecture series be open to all schools of thought in the pursuit of knowledge. As a matter of fact, the very first Milton Friedman lecture took place in this room back in the early 1980s, where Professor Friedman was the guest via telephone. We had this fancy hookup, the story goes, where he was calling in, and we had a panel of professors up here who fielded questions and interacted with Milton Friedman. That was high tech back in the early 80s. Tonight's speaker is David R. Henderson, Emeritus Professor of Economics at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. He's also a research fellow with the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He holds senior fellow appointments at Canada's Fraser Institute and the Independent Institute. Before joining the Naval Postgraduate School, Professor Henderson served as senior economist for health and energy policy on President Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors. He's the editor of the Concise Encyclopedia of Economics, widely regarded as the most accessible reference work in the field. He's the author or co-author of 4 books, including The Joy of Freedom, An Economist's Odyssey, Making Great Decisions in Business and Life, and the essential UCLA School of Economics. He's written more than 300 articles for publications, including Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Barron's, Fortune, the Washington Post, and Reason Magazine. He blogs at David R. Henderson on Substack, right there. His blog is entitled, I Blog to Differ. Professor Henderson has testified before the House Ways and Means Committee, the Senate Armed Services Committee, and the Senate Committee on Labor and Human Resources. He's appeared on C-SPAN, CNN, NPR, BBC, many other outlets. Born and raised in Canada, he moved to the United States in 1972 to earn his PhD in economics at UCLA and became a citizen, a US citizen, in 1986. Tonight, Professor Henderson will speak on how economists help end the draft. Please welcome David Henderson.
I've never been introduced without someone making at least one mistake, so this is a first. Thank you. And actually, I don't even need to show these slides. I can show these slides very quickly. I just never know what you're going to say. But this is what I'm most likely to be remembered for, the Concise Encyclopedia of Economics. This is a book that I wrote with a former student who I taught at Santa Clara University in the early 80s. And I brought a copy along. And I can skip this one because you already mentioned it. I don't want to skip this one. This is me with the man. That's me on the right. And especially because of the topic tonight, and also because of, this is the Milton Friedman Lecture, I want to show this one. That's me with my arms folded. Who's that to the left? Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman. That was in 1975. Sorry, what?
Who is that other guy? The other gentleman?
Jerry O'Driscoll, Jack High, Richard Ebeling, Harry Watson. Know them all. Know them all. One of us died. And the reason I show the Milton Friedman thing, even when I don't give a talk at a Milton Friedman event, is because Milton Friedman is a huge part of the story that I want to tell tonight. He was one of the major players in the move to get rid of the draft. Now, we have the 250th anniversary of both the Declaration of Independence and 2 weeks ago, the publication of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. So I just want to take a minute to talk about a term that you might have heard used, especially people who are older, but maybe some of the younger ones, to describe economics. Who has heard of economics as being called the dismal science? Okay, so the young people haven't heard it, the older people have. Now, here's how you can be, if you ever end up being at a cocktail party of Harvard economics faculty, you can show you know more than they do about one thing. Ask them why it's called the dismal science, and the odds are they're going to say that it was because of Thomas Robert Malthus, who said that agricultural output would expand arithmetically, population would expand exponentially, and we would have really tough times. That's not who came up with it. The person who used the term was British anti-capitalist author Thomas Carlyle. And he used it to criticize the economists at the time, who were largely pro-free market, for opposing slavery. You heard that right. It's dismal because these economists oppose slavery. Now, and here's a famous quote from Adam Smith on slavery from his 1759 book, Theory of Moral Sentiments. All the different republics of Greece were at home almost always distracted by the most furious factions and abroad involved in the most sanguinary wars, sanguinary meaning bloody, in which each sought not merely superiority or dominion, but either completely to extirpate all its enemies, or what was not less cruel, to reduce them into the vilest of all states, that of domestic slavery, and to sell them, man, woman, and child, like so many herds of cattle. So Adam Smith was very outspoken against slavery. Well, there were two periods in time when economists were outspoken against slavery. That one, and the one I'm going to talk about tonight, which is a form of temporary slavery, namely the draft. Now, normally economists aren't thought of as being outspoken advocates, activists, and so on. But this was one of those cases, one of those rare cases where they were. So I come from Canada, which Greg mentioned, where we had a strong tradition of a volunteer military. But we in this country have a strong tradition of volunteer military too, just not quite as strong. And so economists were very involved in getting rid of the draft. And I find it an exciting story and an important story, so we don't forget what were the big arguments they used against the draft. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. Economists started writing about this in the mid-60s through to the early 70s. The draft ended the last draftee was drafted January 27th, 1973. And the draft expired on June 30th, 1973. At the time, I followed the debate closely. Although I'm originally Canadian, as I mentioned, and still lived in Canada when most of these events happened, I was paying a lot of attention to it. I opposed the draft, not because I would be drafted, obviously, but because I was against it philosophically. So before I go on to tell the story of how these economists made their argument and how President Nixon, not one of my favorite presidents, was involved in a good way, I want to kind of illustrate why I'm philosophically against the draft. I've got myself a nice new cap. I'm going to go home and tell my wife, I got this cap for free. Who here thinks I own this cap? Who here thinks I don't? Raise your hand. Who here thinks he owns the cap? Who here thinks that I don't have the right to take it from him? Emily, you have nice hair. Now, I forgot to bring my scissors, but if I had, I would start snipping away and take her hair and go home and maybe sell it. Who here thinks that I have the right to do that? Who here thinks I don't?
I would murder her for that.
Who here thinks I don't? We're on the same wavelength. What I have just laid out is why I'm philosophical. That they take, in some sense, your property, but more importantly, your body. And here's how I put it. In a speech I gave at Carnegie Mellon, there was an attempt to revive the draft in 1979. And here's what I said. What is the thinking of the people who advocate the draft? Whatever their differences, they have one thing in common. They believe that you are a national resource. Well, I'm here to tell you that you belong to you. That you are not a piece of clay to be molded by others. That nobody has the right to take you against your will, no matter who they are, how many votes they have, or what they intend to use you for. In short, my philosophical case against the draft is that you own yourself, I own myself. We all own our own bodies, and therefore no one has the right to take them. We have the right to decide what to do with them. But it became even more personal for me. I was following the draft issue, but it became even more personal for me when I was 18, in the summer of 1969, and I went to a political conference at Rockford College in Rockford, Illinois. And there were most of the people there were Americans, roughly my age, and a lot of the young men were worried about being drafted and going to Vietnam. And I didn't have to worry about that. And that just brought it home, how free I was compared to how unfree they were, having to worry about it. That was the first thing that happened. And then in 1970, after I graduated from college, I was hitchhiking across Canada and down the coast and staying with various people who people in the previous city had told me about. So I was staying with this guy in Tacoma who was running an anti-war coffee house called the Shelter Half. And it was right by Fort Lewis, which at the time was on the last stop on the way to Vietnam. And young soldiers from the fort would like to come off the fort at night when they were on their own time. They had to wear their uniforms, and they like hanging out there. So that's where I hung out. That's where my new friend was working. And my first evening there, I saw this young man across the room who was about from me to Steve. And there was just something compelling about it. So I walked towards him. And in those days, I don't know if they still have to, but they had these little nameplates that gave the first and last name. And for you to get how this drove it home for me, you've got to remember my first and last name. What are they? David Henderson. And his nameplate said, David Henderson. We got talking, and I said, you look kind of scared. He goes, I am. I'm going to Vietnam tomorrow. So we got talking more once we got past that, and I said, where'd you grow up? He says, North Dakota. I said, well, what town or city? Oh, you never would have heard of it. Try me. Dunseith. My family drove 29 miles south from Boise, where I grew up, to Dunseith to watch movies on Sunday night. And I've got a little picture I got off the web. There's Boise, where I grew up. And there's the border, and there's Dunseith. And that just brought it home for me. I was 29 miles lucky. He had a very different future in front of him than the one I had in front of me, because he grew up in a country with the draft, and I didn't. By the way, the good news is when the Vietnam War Memorial was built, I was in the Reagan administration, and one of the first days it was open, I went over, and his name wasn't on it. Now, the other thing that's really relevant here, we have this thing called the U.S. Constitution, and we have this very pesky 13th Amendment. And here's what it says. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall be duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And I say here, my argument with Hubert Humphrey, but I want to keep my talk to 45 minutes. If we have time, I'll get to it, but we might not have time, so I'm going to leave that out for now. Now, as I said, we have a volunteer tradition in this country. Both sides had the draft during the Civil War. We had the draft from 1917 to 1918 during World War I. From 1940, before we got in World War II, until 47. It ended for a year, and then we had it from 48 until 1973. There was a lot of upset about the draft in the mid-60s, but few people were making a case against them on the grounds of principle. One of those few, they were really upset about the Vietnam War, but the draft was kind of secondary. One of those few was Milton Friedman. And there was a conference at the University of Chicago in December 1966 where it was a 4-day conference, and they had various people who were involved in the draft debate, pro and con. So they had a young congressman from Wisconsin, a Democrat named Robert Kastenmeier, a young Republican congressman from Illinois named Donald Rumsfeld, who later became defense secretary. They were both anti-draft. They had pro-draft Senator Edward Kennedy, pro-draft anthropologist Margaret Mead, and anti-draft economist Milton Friedman and Walter Boyd. And there's a whole book which has all of the papers and all of the discussion that took place over those 4 days. And I remember around that time I got the book, pardon me, in the late 60s. And the sense I had reading it was there was a kind of a coalescing of views towards opposing the draft. And sure enough, I was right. Here's what Milton Friedman said in his co-authored autobiography, co-authored with his wife. I've attended many conferences. I have never attended any other that had so dramatic effect on the participants. A straw poll taken at the outset of the conference reported 2/3 of the participants in favor of the draft. A similar poll at the end, 2/3 opposed. I believe that this conference was the key event that started the ball rolling toward ending the draft. Now, economists had an economic argument that if I'd never read economics, I never would have heard. And I want to show it on the board. Who here has had at least one course in economics? Raise your hand. Who here hasn't? Good. Now, if I draw it big, if I draw it like that, and here's a supply curve. Can everyone see that? Okay. Good, because the young people are at the back. So this is the supply of first-term labor to the U.S. military. So here's quantity on this axis and the wage rate on this axis. And let's say we have a volunteer military. And the military wants this number of people, Q1. What's the minimum wage they have to pay to get that number of people? KH, I forgot the rest of your name. Said it right.
Yes.
You go over here, and I'm going to call this WAVF. Okay. So far, no controversy. Here's where the controversy comes. Here's where the economic insight comes. People who favored the draft pointed out that under the draft, you could pay less to first-termers because they didn't have a choice. It was military or prison up to 5 years. And therefore, you could pay less. And so, in fact, by the way, in 1979-80, when I studied all of the 14 bills to reinstitute the draft, all 14 of them had a cut in first-term pay. And the degree varied. So here's WD. Oops, let me try color. Here's WD, the draft wage, and they still want to get Q1. Will they get volunteers, any volunteers at WD? What?
Depends on the economic circumstances of the person that is up for the draft.
It does, but specifically, what do we know from the supply curve? What? They'll get this number. Those people still find it worthwhile to join. But then there's a shortfall. They want this number more, but these people no longer find it attractive. So the military has to draft this quantity. Is there any guarantee that the people they get will be these people? No, they'll avoid it. People up here will avoid it. And therefore, some people here who would have joined with an all-volunteer wage won't join and would be displaced by people up here, right? Which means people whose, and I'm going to use a term here that you might have seen, might not have seen, supply price. It's closely related to opportunity cost. The supply price is the minimum price at which you're willing to join. Well, you'll have some people whose supply prices were here, displaced by some people whose supply prices are up here. So it's actually a more costly military. You don't look at the budget, you look at what's given up. And here with the volunteer military, people's supply prices shows what they gave up. Well, these people will be the same, but then these people will be, some of them will be replaced by people up here with higher supply prices. So the Economist's insight is that a drafted military is actually more expensive. Now, one of the first things I remember as a kid is when Elvis Presley got drafted in 1958. He was making over $1 million a year in those years dollars. And he was getting paid $2,000, something like that. So think of the loss to him. Huge. If it were today, think of, say, Justin Bieber or someone like that. Although Justin's a fellow Canuck, so maybe he wouldn't be drafted. And then there are less extreme examples. The person who knows what he wants to do, go out and start a business, but he can't because he gets drafted. Or think of the college football player who needs those years to prep for the NFL. Does anyone know what the average length of time an NFL player is an NFL player for?
5 years.
3.5. And so those could be really costly years because you can essentially make half of your lifetime income in your 3.5 years. And some of them might be gone. So huge loss, and as one person put it in a book, he had a great title for his book in which he analyzed the draft in the 1960s. It puts the wrong man in uniform. It displaces some people here who would have willingly gone at the all-volunteer force wage with people up here who don't want to go. So you get actually a more costly military. It's just who bears the cost. So here's how Milton Friedman put it. He often put it well. This is no exception. Yes?
Question. How much of Elvis's draft was really a method of propaganda to enhance the draft? I mean, to encourage young men, look, Elvis did it.
Well, maybe
You can do, I mean, how much of it was propaganda?
I don't
reality?
know. I don't know, but I don't need to know
Right.
in order to know what I just pointed out.
Right.
Yeah, that's
But I
what
mean,
it is. Yeah. So here's how Friedman put it at that conference. The real cost of conscripting a soldier who would not voluntarily serve in present terms is not the pay and the cost of his keep. It is the amount for which he'd be willing to serve. That's the supply price. He is implicitly paying the difference. This is the extra cost to him. Must be added to the cost borne by the rest of us. When he is forced to serve, we are in effect imposing on him a tax in kind equal in value to the difference between what it would take to attract him and the military pay he actually receives. This implicit tax in kind should be added to the explicit taxes imposed on the rest of us to get the real cost of our armed forces. As Greg mentioned, I testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee in 1979, and that's what that was about. There was a move by Senator Sam Nunn of Georgia to reintroduce the draft, and I found out about it. I was an assistant professor at the University of Rochester. I drove down and testified before him, and he and I went back and forth pretty intensely. And here's what I said when he kept insisting that the draft was cheaper. And you can find this, by the way, in the transcript online. What I'm saying is that the cost of a good quality military is there. There's no avoiding that fact. All you are talking about is whom you make bear the cost. The cost is not any lower when you are paying 30% of the budget in wages. It's just that you are imposing the cost on these young people. That is what you are advocating. You are not advocating a lower cost military. You are not advocating lower cost of labor. You are just advocating that taxpayers in general not bear the cost and young draftees bear the cost. As William Mecklin, who I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, put it in an article in Fortune magazine in 1978, when there was this move to bring back the draft. The title of his article was "The Draft is a High Tax on Unlucky Young Men." So updating the data for today, let's say the pay when you have a draft is going to be $16,000, and the person's supply price is $28,000. The tax is $12,000, which is a large, large number. There's also the cost of avoidance. And in fact, well, I'll tell you a story. One of Milton Friedman's students, who was one of my professors, told us how he got around the draft. He loved donuts. And you could get around the draft by flunking the physical. So he bought a dozen donuts a day for 60 days and ate them all and put on 40 to 50 pounds and flunked his physical. There were a lot of things you could do to avoid the draft. So much so there was a song about it called "The Draft Dodger Rag." Does it sound familiar?
Oh, I was thinking of Arlo Guthrie, but that's fine.
Okay. Anyone want to hear me sing the song? Is that a yes?
Sure.
Well, I'm just 18, got a ruptured spleen, and I always carry a purse. Got eyes like a bat, and my feet are flat, and my asthma's getting worse. Think of my career, got a sweetheart dear, and a poor old invalid aunt. Besides, I ain't no fool, I'm a-going to school, and a-working in a defense plant. So, there's the avoidance cost. I'm going to say more about that in a few minutes, but there's also the cost of enforcement. There was a student in my philosophy class at University of Winnipeg from Minnesota who was a draft dodger. That was one way around it. Go to Canada or go to Sweden. And while he was a student there at University of Winnipeg, his father died in Minnesota. Do you think he went to the funeral? No way. And he was wise because the FBI showed up at the funeral. Another friend tried to be a draft dodger within the United States. And finally, they caught up with him, and he was going to trial in 1976. And he calculated at the time, in those years' dollars, the government must have spent about $100,000 catching him and putting together the prosecution. And didn't go to trial because Carter granted amnesty. But those are large numbers. Now, one of the heroes in this, and I say hero because as I said, I'm in favor of getting rid of the draft, so I like these people who work to do it, is an economist named Walter Oy. Look closely at his face. Tell me two things you notice. What nationality is it? Japanese. Look at his eyes. He's blind. He went blind in graduate school. Now, I interviewed at the University of Rochester and I could tell my seminar went really well. I was going to get an offer, which I did. And he was there at the time. And I was feeling so good about my seminar, I had 2 drinks, which is really unusual for me. And on the second drink, I looked across the table, sized him up, and said, Walter, were you held prisoner by the U.S. government during World War II? Now, what do you think I was thinking? Internment camp. And he said, yes. Our family was taken to Santa Anita Raceway, and we lived in a horse stall for a few days. Now, why was Walter Oy so important? Well, he did a big calculation in here on the budgetary cost of getting rid of the draft. So the economists understood the draft is actually more costly, but the costs are borne by the draftees and by people trying to avoid it. They're not on anyone's budget. So you do know that if you get rid of the draft, you're going to have to raise the wage, but the question is how much. And Walter did this study. The DOD had put such a broad range on it, $4 billion to $17 billion per year. Compare that to the whole U.S. federal budget. If it was $17 billion, no way you're going to get rid of it, because that's a double-digit % increase in the budget just for that one thing. Oy figured out quickly the reasonable range of the estimates was $4 to $8 billion, and his best estimate was $5.5 billion per year, which is more doable because that's like 4% of the budget. Now, why the range? And why did he come to the lower end of that 4 to 8? 2 factors. He pointed out, who here has heard the term elasticity of supply? He pointed out that they were assuming a very low elasticity of supply, so if you paid more, you wouldn't get that many more. And he gave his grounds for thinking the supply was more elastic, which means you pay more, you get a lot more. And they assumed a re-enlistment rate from the draft era. But wait a minute, if you're getting volunteers, they're more likely to want to be there, and therefore they're more likely to want to stay there. And so that's how he got his number. So he was a major player, and Friedman gives him a lot of credit. Another major player was a guy named Martin Anderson, who was a colleague of mine at the Hoover Institution. In 1967, he was a young economics professor at Columbia University, and he said some things at a party one night that caused these people to say, you should talk to Richard Nixon's campaign staff. Nixon had lost in 1960 to Kennedy. He was tooling up to run in 1968, and he was a lawyer in New York. So Marty Anderson ended up talking to Nixon, and here's what he said. Well, first of all, he talked to the campaign staff. He went to their meetings, and at the time, Nixon had supported universal military training because his big boss, when he was vice president, was Dwight Eisenhower, and that's what Eisenhower believed in. And then I put in bold the really neat thing he suggested. He said, I probably suggested that the thing to do was get rid of the draft, and they, his campaign staff, were a little astonished at that. He said, one thing led to another. I wrote for Nixon a long paper arguing you could get rid of the military draft for two reasons. One is it would make the military much stronger, and two, it was the right thing to do. And by the way, Marty gave me a hard copy of that paper. Now, here's what's interesting about Nixon. As I said, for many other reasons I could get into, but won't, Nixon was not a hero to me. But on this, he was very good. My recollection is that Nixon took the paper, didn't say anything. He sent copies out to his national security people. Half of them thought it was a really good idea, and they should do it. The other half thought it would destroy the country. So, December 1967, just months after he's met Marty Anderson, I was out, so he's already now on his campaign staff. I was out traveling with Nixon. A young reporter from the New York Times was on board the airplane named Bob Semple. At one point, he suddenly said, "And what's your position on the draft?" Nixon looked at him and suddenly said, "Well, I've been busy. I've been thinking about this. And what we need to do is get rid of the draft." And he just laid out Marty's whole position. Semple was stunned. It was a big story in the New York Times the next day. As far as I know, Nixon hadn't talked to anyone else, just announced it, and that became the policy. And he stuck with it. He made a radio address on CBS in October 1968 and talked as if he was talking to economists. The principal incentives are the most obvious: higher pay and increased benefits. The military services are the only employers today who don't have to compete in the job market. Supplied by the draft with the manpower they want, when they want it, they've been able to ignore the laws of supply and demand. Now, let me ask you something. Do politicians ever break their word? Nixon ran against the draft. He won in a very tight election. Well, Marty Anderson joined his staff, and Marty wasn't about to let him forget that promise. So Marty had a role in choosing something called the President's Commission on the All-Volunteer Force. It was called the Gates Commission after Thomas Gates, who had been the Secretary of Defense from 1959 to 1961 under Eisenhower. And here's the conversation Gates and Nixon had. Gates: "Mr. President, I'm opposed to the whole idea of a volunteer force. You don't want me as the chairman." Nixon: "Yes, I do, Tom. That's exactly why I want you as the chairman. You have experience and integrity. If you change your mind and think we should end the draft, then I'll know it's a good idea." Now, most of the time, when you choose a presidential commission, you want to go one of two ways. You want so many different views that nothing ever happens. Or you want everyone on the same page so they're going to say what you want them to say. This was not either of those. This was 5 people completely against the draft, including Milton Friedman and Alan Greenspan. 5 people completely against the draft and 5 people on the fence. Well, how's that going to work? Now, the staff of the Gates Commission was chosen largely by the executive director, William H. Meckling, who I mentioned briefly. He was my employer. He was the dean of the business school when I joined the University of Rochester much later. And he said to me once, he said in a speech I attended in Rochester, "I thought I'd be estimating supply curves. In other words, I thought it was a done deal and we're figuring out what the budget cost is." Wrong. They had to make a case against the draft. And when I interviewed with him, I know how assistant professors are supposed to be. They're supposed to say, how much do I have to teach? Will I get summer money? He was my hero. I want to know all about his experience. And he was the first serious adult who studied the issue, who agreed with me that we didn't need the draft during World War II because it was a tremendous waste of manpower. And he said, you'd have people picking up cigarettes on bases and so on. So go back to this. If this is the demand curve, well, guess what? At an artificially low wage, they want more of those people. And the extreme was that my conversation with him reminded me of was a German economist named von Thunen. And here's what he said. I'm not going to read it all, but I want to summarize those first things and then get to his bottom line. If you regard people as free labor, you're going to overuse it. Whereas if you have to buy cannons, you have to pay for cannons. You got to take account of the loss of cannons. And here was the example he used. When the statement was made to Napoleon, the founder of the conscription system, that a planned operation would cost too many men, he replied, "Ce n'est rien." That is nothing. The women produce more of them than I can use. Fun guy, huh? Now, the Gates Commission, I mentioned avoidance. The Gates Commission did an estimate of the avoidance cost. Huge, the biggest one was what they call schooling distortions. Remember, I'm going to college, remember the song? Well, if you're going to college, you can get around the draft more likely. And so they estimated that 1.5 to 25 billion in losses due to that. Changing your occupation so you avoid the draft. A few other things. The total avoidance cost in those years' dollars, 3 to 4 billion, which would be approximately 25 to 35 billion in today's dollars. So those were large costs. Now, what's this schooling avoidance cost? I just singled that out because they laid it out in their study. And here's what they said. If a man attends college only to avoid the draft, the social cost is his foregone output on the labor market minus the true value of education. So if he's not really valuing education that much, that's a loss. And that was the single biggest component. Now, Meckling had a lot of very good economists on the staff estimating all these things. And I left the school in 1979. He died in 1997. I found out about it at the time I was writing a monthly column for Silicon Valley magazine called The Red Herring. And here's what I wrote. If you're an American male under age 44, take a moment of silence to thank William H. Meckling, who died last year at age 76. Even though you probably haven't heard of him, he has had a profound effect on your life. What he did was help end military conscription in the United States. Between 1948 and 1973, here's what you knew if you were a healthy male born in the USA. The government could pluck you out of almost any activity you were pursuing, cut your hair, and send you anywhere in the world. If the United States was at war, you might have to kill people, and you might return home in a body bag. Now, when I wrote this, I like to research, and so I interviewed his widow, who had become a friend of mine, Becky, and she told me what his favorite moment was in the hearings. They had analysis, but they also had hearings where they wanted to hear from people on both sides. And General William Westmoreland, who'd been in charge of the troops in Vietnam, fairly unsuccessfully, had come back, and he was now Army Chief of Staff. And in his testimony, and Friedman was there, Westmoreland said he didn't want to command an army of mercenaries. And so Becky said this was his favorite moment, the way Friedman handled it. So what did Friedman say? Friedman interrupted. General, would you rather command an army of slaves? Westmoreland replied, I don't like to hear our patriotic draftees referred to as slaves. Friedman responded, I don't like to hear our patriotic volunteers referred to as mercenaries. If they are mercenaries, then I, sir, am a mercenary professor. You, sir, are a mercenary general. We are served by mercenary physicians. We use a mercenary lawyer, and we get our meat from a mercenary butcher. Now, Walter Hoy did some slightly updated budget estimates. He came up with a number of $4.55 billion for the Gates Commission. Federal spending had gone up meanwhile, and that was $1970, not $1965. So that was a 2% increase in federal spending. So that sounds more doable, right? Now, as I said, it was 5, 5, and 5. They voted. Here was the vote. 14 in favor of getting rid of the draft, 0 in favor of keeping it, and 1 abstention. Who was the abstainer? Roy Wilkins, who was head of the NAACP, but here's what's interesting. Here's his letter to Nixon that's published in their report. And again, I've just highlighted the most interesting parts. He was sick, and that prevented my participating in the last 5 commission meetings during which the recommendations were made. But look at his last sentence. I would like to endorse the basic idea of moving towards an all-volunteer armed force and to express my hope that you will be able to take steps in the near future to reduce reliance on conscription. That's pretty successful. The report comes out early and under budget in 1969, and the draft ends in 1973, so it took a while that it ended. And if I'd had time, I would have talked about this other player, but I don't have time, so I'm going to skip that. And as I said, there was a move to reintroduce the draft and draft registration. Reagan got the Republican nomination in 1980, and Marty Anderson, who I talked about, was on his staff, and Marty made sure that he got a sentence in there that if I'm elected, I will get rid of registration. Oh, I forgot to say, they had registration when they got rid of the draft. Gerald Ford, looking for ways to cut the deficit, ended registration in 1975, and Carter got it back in 1980, so Reagan promised to get rid of it. Young men in this room probably know what happened to that promise. But I thought I want to do my best to try to hold his feet to the fire. So in the summer of 1980, I wrote an Economist statement against the draft and sent it around to economists around the country. And here's what it said. We, the undersigned, propose moves toward the reimposition of the draft. The draft would be a more costly way of maintaining the military than an all-volunteer force. Those who claim that a draft costs less than a volunteer military cite as savings the lower wages the government can get away with paying, but they leave out the burden on the draftees themselves. This is probably sounding familiar by now. I love this last sentence. I really worked with this one. Saying that a draft would reduce the cost of the military is like saying that the pyramids were cheap because they were built with slave labor. Now, all I had, I was a young assistant professor at Santa Clara University, so I had enough money for stamps. And I sent it around to a whole bunch of economists, and I got 280 signatures, but by the time I wanted to do it, I had 140. So I went with that, and I didn't have the money to put an ad, full-page ad in a magazine, but 3 magazines loved what we said. Libertarian Review, a Libertarian magazine, Inquiry, a Libertarian magazine, and The Progressive, a left-wing magazine in Wisconsin, and they all gave me a full page for that. And the signers included, of course, Milton Friedman, Alan Greenspan, Milton's son David, Donald McCloskey, who's now Deirdre McCloskey, William Meckley, William Niskanen, Vernon Smith, who won the Nobel Prize in 2002. Now, what are the results? The results are the military is very successful. I taught, as I mentioned, at the Naval Postgraduate School for 33 years. And when I got there, there were people older than me who had remembered the era of the draft. And I would ask them, do you want to bring back the draft? And the voting was lopsided, like 8-1. And then a couple of years later, 10-1. And then after a while, it was 20-0. So I quit asking. No one wanted to bring back the draft. And I'd say, why? Well, think about these officers being in charge of people. Why would they not want to bring back the draft? Yeah.
It's a management headache. It's a management headache.
Yes.
I had one of my troops try to kill me.
That's a good reason. That's a good reason. What they would say wasn't quite that extreme, but it was, why would I want to be in charge of people who don't want to be there? And so one of the biggest bulwarks we have against the draft is the military itself. So we've had now 2 generations without the draft. And I just want to address one last issue before I get to Q&A. And that is the issue. When registration was reintroduced, someone went all the way to the Supreme Court to say they should register women. And the argument the Supreme Court made was, well, women can't be in combat. Well, now women can be in combat. So what might happen is a move to have registration of women. And sure enough, when that combat thing happened a few years ago, this Marine major, a friend and colleague of mine named Chad Siegman, and I wrote a piece because people were treating it as if it's an opportunity for women. And we said, why celebrate the opportunity for women to be forced at the point of a weapon to fight and die for their country, especially considering if they actually want to do such a thing, the option's now entirely open to them. We said the creation of the all-volunteer force was one of the greatest victories for freedom in our country in the 20th century. Because of it, our government must ask men and women to wear the full nation. So those who answer the call tend to be particularly dedicated, committed, and qualified. And I'll end with this. Women have made many significant advances in the struggle for freedom in this country, helping to finally eliminate one of the most barbarous institutions in our country's history. Once and for all, would make a fine contribution to that legacy. Thank you. Now, we have time for Q&A, but also I have this little, so Milton Friedman became my friend. I knocked on his door when I was 19, and he always gave me tips about my career, some of which I took. And I have little tips to give undergrads. So I don't know, should I wait till after Q&A or do it now?
Sounds like you want to do it.
But I don't want a short Q&A. Okay. So who here is a freshman? Okay, enough of you. Here's the little tip I give freshmen and sometimes sophomores. When you're looking at the college catalog, you don't take the course, take the professor. You can have a course that a topic seems inherently interesting, and a bad professor can make it incredibly boring. You can have a topic that looks not that interesting, and a really good professor can make it interesting, and you'll learn a lot. And I don't mean take the professor to get the easy A's. I don't mean that. I think sophomores have probably figured that out, and juniors and seniors have. Now this is for juniors and seniors. Let's say you're doing reasonably well in your course, and you're trying to figure out what to do, and you don't know what to do next. A temptation is to say, I don't know what I'll do, so I'll go to law school. Or I don't know what I'll do, so I'll get an MBA. Or I don't know what I want to do, so I'll get a PhD. Those are bad reasons. Because what happens? Let's say you're good enough that you succeed either law school, MBA, or graduate school, and now you're in your mid to late 20s. And then after a few years, you decide you don't like it. So now you're like 31, and maybe you have a family. And the great thing about this country is we are so wealthy, you can change even then, but it's a lot harder than what? Deciding at age 21 or 22 to look around for what you want to do, try a few things, figure it out, and maybe by 23 or 24, you've figured it out, and you've saved yourself a lot of headache. So Milton Friedman used to call himself my Dutch uncle. That's the guy who gives tough love. This is me being Dutch Uncle David. Okay, Q&A. What's your name again?
Jackie Ritchie.
Jackie.
You didn't mention, well, you said that in World War II, they weren't using the soldiers well, they were having them clean it. Okay, now that kind of work is contracted. You don't have soldiers peeling potatoes.
Yeah.
So that it's cheaper to contract that out because that'll be minimum wage.
No, it's much higher, but it is cheaper.
Yeah.
The big thing that makes it cheaper is you don't have to give them a pension. That's what makes it cheaper.
And the technology is so much greater now.
Yes.
So the cost of training people is much greater.
Yes. I'm glad you said that. The Office of the Secretary of Defense in 1986 said, let's redo something the Gates Commission did. Let's look at what it would cost to reintroduce a draft just budget-wise. Remembering that we've got a much higher tech military even then and a longer training period. And so what they said is, we don't want to get the same size military, we want to get the same effectiveness of military, which means if you're going to have a draft, you need a bigger military because they aren't as effective. And why aren't they as effective? Because the typical draft term was 2 years, whereas the typical term when you join voluntarily is 4 years. And with the way training goes nowadays, you're not getting much productivity out of them for the first year and a half. And then 6 months later, they're gone. And so you need more people coming in, you need more trainers and so on. So they found, under a wide range of assumptions about elasticity of supply, that even the budgetary cost of a partially drafted military was higher, which is very interesting. I met you at dinner. What's your first name?
Mark.
Mark, right.
Yeah, fine. So thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
So,
You're welcome.
You kind of open with the very Kantian "you belong to you," like big on autonomy,
Yes.
as an argument against the draft.
Yes.
But most of the talk obviously was more about the economic view. And so like what I took from
Most of the talk was what?
From an economic perspective.
Right. But by the way, just one thing before you go on. I asked Walter Roy about this. Did you just do it as an economist, or were you in principle against the draft? He said, absolutely, I was in principle against the draft. Go ahead.
So you've made the argument that ending the draft was both the right thing to do and a good thing to do.
Yes.
As a sort of unreconstructed Chicago school free market person, what does one do when the right thing to do is not always the good thing to do?
Well, I'd have to know more. Have to know whether that's true even.
Okay. Or I should say, like from a philosophical point of view, would you say as an economist, would you say that if it's economically advantageous, that's what makes it the right thing?
No, what makes it the right thing is that people get to choose. So here's what I'll do that might answer your question. As I said, I grew up in Canada. Canada joined World War I the same year, the same day Britain did. They had a volunteer military. And the government had made a commitment to keep it volunteer throughout the war. They started running out of people. They didn't think to raise the wage. They started running out of people. They were kind of honorable, which is an amazing thing to say about a government. But they had a referendum in Canada, the only national referendum Canada's ever had, as far as I know. Will you let us out of our commitment to avoid the draft? And the vote was overwhelmingly yes. So they got rid of the commitment. They had a draft for about a year. World War II, they entered in 1939, over 2 years before we, now I'm thinking of myself as an American, before we did, and they had a volunteer force. They had a volunteer force up until 1944, started running out of people. And they introduced a draft that said, we won't put draftees in combat. And so anyway, what I'm pointing out is we do have countries, and Canada had a very big commitment in both World War I and World War II. We do have countries that did it largely without a draft. Steve.
If we carry this thought process on to the next step logically, could we say this draft phenomenon is a negative externality, the way, say, air pollution is, because there are implicit costs borne outside of the raw dollars?
Yes, and I'll be specific about that. Think back to the von Thunen quote about Napoleon. Napoleon's making this decision that has huge negative effects on others that he's not taking account of. And that's the extreme, but even less extreme. Think of William Westmoreland, who just wastes manpower going for body count. And, so yeah, there's a huge negative externality. Now, I've noticed that all the questions so far have been people with, to the extent they have hair, this color. So I'd like to hear from at least one undergrad, if I may. We can go back to the other people, but I want to give others a chance. Anyone? I see 3 young women there, and it's like, are you itching to ask something or say something? Yes.
Not particularly.
Oh, what's your name?
My name is Kaya.
Kaya? Oh no, I've been doing badly on Kayannana.
It's just Diana with a K instead of a D.
Okay.
But I guess like I don't have any specific questions about your lecture, but I guess I could just kind of ask more about yourself and like kind of why you chose to go into economics. Because I myself I'm a double major in finance and economics.
Yeah.
So just kind of like why you decided that and your choice.
Sure, I was actually telling someone about that at dinner. So I was a math major, but my first year of college, I read a novel by a woman named Ayn Rand. And the novel was titled The Fountainhead. Who here has read anything by Ayn Rand? Better than I'm usually getting. But anyway, you're missing out on something. Now, I find it's bimodal. It's like you love it or you hate it, but still it's worth trying. And it just opened my eyes to things I hadn't thought about. And then I read her other stuff. And then I started reading her nonfiction stuff. And she recommended this book by an economic journalist named Henry Hazlitt called Economics in One Lesson. And you can find it a PDF free online. And I read it in one sitting. It wasn't a big book. And it just opened my eyes to just the economic way of thinking. And then I just followed that. I came across a column by Milton Friedman in Newsweek back in the late 60s. And it was, wow, that's neat. And then I became a libertarian. And our libertarian club couldn't afford Milton Friedman. So we got an economist we'd never heard of named Harold Demsetz, who came to the University of Winnipeg. He gave 3 lectures in 2 days. And I calculated I must have been with him for over 10 hours. And these lectures were eye-opening. One was on how free markets make you bear, if you're an employer or a landlord, make you bear a cost for discriminating on racial grounds because you'll miss out on a potentially good employee or potentially good tenant of a different color. That was just eye-opening. It was just kind of obvious once he said it and he had the data and everything. It just, I'd never heard it. Another one was on pollution, and he laid out how private property rights can help solve certain pollution problems. And later in my book, The Joy of Freedom, an Economist's Odyssey, I have a chapter titled The Environment, Own It and Save It. Anyway, so we took him to the airport, and he said to me, you should come down to Chicago and get a PhD in economics or business. And I, with my typical Canadian humility, which was not put on, I said, I don't know if I'm good enough. He goes, you're good enough. So anyway, that's kind of how it happened. And so I got really lucky, knowing at age 19 what I wanted to do. My mother had died in December 69. He came to our school in January 70. She left my sister, brother, and me about $7,000 each in her life insurance and other things. And I'd always wanted to be around airplanes and airports. I started taking pilot lessons. I took 3 lessons. Harold Demsetz shows up. I go, I'm stopping. I'm going to save for graduate school. And now we can go back to other people who I discouraged if you want. So you're in your last year?
No, I'm a sophomore.
Oh, okay, good. So you got time. Yeah. I mean, one thing to do, to the extent you can, is get internships and just try things out in the summer. That's one thing to do. And I've been an advocate of not having the minimum wage. Well, I think the minimum wage is a really bad idea because it prices people out of the labor market. But it's also a really bad idea for interns because either you've got to pay people the minimum wage or you have to pay them 0. Well, what about the one who comes from a kind of a working class family who could make it getting paid $5 an hour? Well, that's not an option. So isn't it weird that the government says, you got to pay $7.25 an hour federal minimum wage, or you can pay 0. But don't let me catch you paying anything between 0 and $7.25. Now that is weird.
Last call. Any other questions? Way in the back.
What's your name?
Sawyer.
Sawyer, S-A-W-Y-E-R as in Tom?
Yeah.
Got it. Yes.
Again, this isn't necessarily related to your lecture, but I'm just curious, how many presidents were you able to meet, and which one was your favorite to talk to?
Which one of the ones I met was my favorite?
Sure, yeah.
It's easy because I met Reagan. I worked for Nixon as a summer intern at the Council of Economic Advisors when the big boss was Herb Stein, that was the chairman. But I didn't meet him. I was at a speech he gave, but the only one and Reagan I met when he was governor, and when he was ex-president, I never was in a meeting with him. I was at speeches he gave where there were anywhere between a couple hundred and a couple thousand people, but only before and after he was president. So the ones I met, my favorite was Reagan. My favorite president, though, is the guy from Kinderhook, the Dutchman, Van Buren. See, one of the things that got me promoted to full professor well after my hair was gray was this study I did when I noticed historians judging people as good presidents when they got a lot of us killed in war. In other words, if you look at how many people a president gets killed in war, he's rated high. Because historians look at war and, hey, he won or whatever. What about the president? And so what we did was a regression analysis where we looked at this other study. They hadn't put that in, and we put the percent of the population killed in war. And the greater that was, the higher the historians rated him. Van Buren avoided 2 wars. So he doesn't get in the history books because it didn't happen. But he figured out how to avoid them, which is really good. So that's why I like Van Buren.
Dave,
I should tell one more story about minimum wage.
Go for it.
And internships. So I was at home one day about 10 or 12 years ago, and this guy calls up from a local TV station, and he wants to interview me about minimum wage. He's talked to this state senator who's all in favor of raising it in California, and he's heard that I'm against it, and I am. He says he'll come over to my house, which is even better. So he records me, and I'd forgotten his first name, but his last name was Reiner, R-E-I-N-E-R. And I laid out, because he was a young guy, I laid out my intern argument he gave, that I just gave you. And I said, so for example, like, where did you grow up? And he goes, Brentwood. I said, okay, that might be hard for you to get my argument because you grew up in a relatively wealthy family. Oh, by the way, your name's Reiner. Any relation to Rob? Yeah, he's my dad. So that was kind of interesting. Okay, thank you.